Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American Northeast. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are hearing this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the winter of 1848, a peculiar discovery was made in the archives of the Berkshire County Courthouse in Massachusetts. Buried beneath decades of routine legal documents, a clerk named Thomas Whitmore uncovered a series of handwritten reports that had been deliberately misfiled. The papers bore the official seal of the state medical examiner, yet their contents defied every convention of 19th century scientific documentation. At the center of these reports was the name Elijah Freeman, a man whose existence seemed to challenge the very boundaries between life and death. The documents suggested that Freeman had been the subject of an unauthorized medical study conducted by Dr. Marcus Blackwood, a physician whose credentials were as questionable as his methods. According to the scattered testimonies contained within the file, Freeman had been acquired through what the papers euphemistically termed a private arrangement with local slave traders, despite slavery having been abolished in Massachusetts decades earlier. The circumstances of this acquisition remained deliberately vague, buried in language so careful it seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate. What made Freeman's case extraordinary was not his tragic circumstances as an enslaved man, but rather the inexplicable nature of his physical condition. Multiple witnesses, including Dr. Blackwood himself, testified that Freeman continued to exhibit signs of consciousness and awareness even after suffering injuries that should have proven fatal. The medical reports, written in Blackwood's meticulous script, documented a series of observations that seemed to defy every principle of human physiology known to 19th century medicine. The first documented encounter with Freeman occurred in the late summer of 1847, when he was brought to Blackwood's private clinic on the outskirts of Lenox, Massachusetts. The clinic operated in a converted farmhouse, far from the scrutiny of Boston's established medical community. Blackwood had purchased the property using funds inherited from his deceased father, a textile merchant who had made his fortune in the cotton trade. The isolation of the location was not accidental. Blackwood's work required absolute privacy. Freeman was described in the initial reports as a man of approximately 28 years of age, though his exact date of birth remained unknown. His physical appearance was unremarkable except for a series of old scars across his back and shoulders, evidence of a lifetime spent under the lash. What struck Dr. Blackwood immediately was not Freeman's physical condition, but rather his eyes. Multiple witnesses would later describe them as possessing an unusual clarity, as if Freeman perceived something invisible to others. The medical examinations began innocuously enough. Blackwood documented Freeman's vital signs, measured his physical responses, and conducted what he termed baseline assessments of cognitive function. Freeman displayed normal reactions to stimuli, responded appropriately to verbal commands, and showed no signs of mental deficiency. Yet something in his manner suggested a profound disconnection from his immediate surroundings, as if he existed simultaneously in the present moment and somewhere else entirely. As autumn progressed into winter, Blackwood's experiments grew increasingly invasive. The doctor had become convinced that Freeman possessed some unique physiological characteristic that warranted intensive study. The exact nature of these experiments was never fully documented, but surviving correspondence between Blackwood and his colleague Dr. Samuel Morrison suggests they involved exposing Freeman to conditions that would prove fatal to ordinary men. One letter, dated December 15, 1847, contained Morrison's horrified response to Blackwood's latest findings. Morrison wrote that he could not accept the validity of Blackwood's observations, that no man could survive the trials Blackwood described. Yet Morrison's protests were tempered by his scientific curiosity. He agreed to travel to Lennox to witness the experiments firsthand, a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Morrison's own account, discovered among his papers after his death in 1863, provided the most detailed description of Freeman's condition. According to Morrison, Freeman had sustained injuries that should have rendered him unconscious within minutes. Yet he remained alert, responsive, and apparently free from pain. Morrison documented these observations with the precision of a trained scientist, yet his handwriting betrayed a growing sense of unease as the experiments continued. The winter of 1847 proved exceptionally harsh throughout New England. Snow began falling in November and continued almost without interruption through February. The isolation of Blackwood's clinic became nearly complete, with the nearest neighbors living more than 2 miles away across frozen farmland. This isolation may have contributed to what Morrison later described as the atmosphere of unreality that pervaded the farmhouse during Freeman's final months. Freeman himself seemed unaffected by his circumstances. Morrison noted that he displayed no visible signs of distress, fear, or even basic self-preservation instincts. When addressed directly, Freeman would respond with perfect politeness, yet his answers often seemed to reference experiences or memories that bore no relation to his current situation. He spoke frequently of a place he called the Crossing, though neither Blackwood nor Morrison could determine what this meant. Local records from the period provide little additional insight into Freeman's background. The town of Lennox maintained careful documentation of its residents, both permanent and temporary, yet Freeman's name appeared in no official capacity. Church records, which typically noted the presence of any person of African descent in the community, contained no reference to him. It was as if Freeman existed in a space entirely separate from the normal flow of human society. The servants who worked at Blackwood's clinic provided their own testimonies, though these were not officially recorded until years later. Mary Patterson, who served as cook and housekeeper, told her family that Freeman required no food or water, yet showed no signs of weakness or deterioration. She described watching him stand motionless for hours at the window of his room, staring out at the snow-covered landscape as if waiting for something that never came. James Morrison, Samuel's younger brother and Blackwood's assistant, maintained detailed notes throughout the winter months. His observations focused primarily on Freeman's remarkable physical resilience, but also documented more subtle anomalies. Freeman cast no reflection in the mirrors that lined Blackwood's examination room. His body temperature remained constant regardless of the external conditions. Most unsettling of all, Freeman seemed to possess an uncanny awareness of events occurring beyond the confines of the clinic. On several occasions, Freeman accurately described visitors approaching the farmhouse long before they became visible from any window. He knew when letters arrived, though the postal carrier left them in a box at the end of the long driveway. He predicted changes in weather with perfect accuracy, sometimes days in advance. These abilities might have been dismissed as coincidence, except for their consistent accuracy over the course of several months. Dr. Blackwood's correspondence from this period reveals his growing obsession with documenting Freeman's condition. Letters to colleagues in Boston and New York describe a man who seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human experience. Blackwood wrote extensively about the potential scientific implications of his findings, yet his excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. Several letters contain references to strange dreams and the sensation of being watched, even when alone in the clinic. The first sign that something had gone seriously wrong came in late February, when Dr. Morrison arrived for his weekly visit to find the clinic in complete silence. The servants were gone, their personal belongings removed as if they had departed in haste. Dr. Blackwood was discovered in his study, seated at his desk with his head resting on an open journal. The final entry in the journal was dated 3 days earlier and consisted of a single line written in increasingly erratic handwriting. "He is not what we believed him to be." Freeman was found in his room on the 3rd floor of the farmhouse. According to Morrison's account, Freeman appeared exactly as he had during their last meeting, showing no signs of distress or change. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Freeman no longer responded to verbal commands or seemed aware of Morrison's presence. He stood at the window, motionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the frozen landscape. Morrison's attempts to rouse Freeman proved unsuccessful. Physical contact produced no response. Loud noises failed to draw his attention. Yet Freeman continued to breathe. His heart continued to beat, and his eyes remained open and alert. Morrison later wrote that Freeman seemed to have departed while somehow remaining physically present, as if his consciousness had simply chosen to exist elsewhere. The local authorities were summoned, though their investigation proved perfunctory. Sheriff William Hayes documented the scene, but seemed eager to conclude the matter as quickly as possible. His official report noted that Dr. Blackwood had apparently suffered a sudden cardiac event, though no physician was consulted to confirm this diagnosis. Freeman was described simply as an individual of uncertain status who appeared to be in good health but required specialized care. Freeman was subsequently transferred to the Berkshire County Almshouse, where he remained for exactly 37 days. The almshouse records, meticulously maintained by Superintendent Margaret Walsh, documented Freeman's continued refusal to eat, drink, or acknowledge the presence of others. Yet his physical condition remained stable throughout his stay. Walsh noted in her personal diary that Freeman seemed to exist in a state she could only describe as suspended animation. The end came without warning or apparent cause. On the morning of April 7, 1848, Walsh discovered Freeman's body in his small room at the almshouse. He appeared to have simply stopped breathing sometime during the night. There were no signs of struggle or distress. His face bore an expression of profound peace, as if he had finally reached the destination he had been seeking throughout his extraordinary ordeal. The official cause of death was recorded as failure of the vital organs, a diagnosis so vague as to be meaningless. No autopsy was performed, despite Dr. Morrison's requests for a thorough medical examination. Freeman's body was buried in an unmarked grave in the almshouse cemetery, a fate shared by dozens of other individuals whose lives had ended in anonymity and poverty. Yet Freeman's story did not end with his burial. Over the following months, several unusual incidents were reported by individuals who had been present during his final days. Mary Patterson, the former cook at Blackwood's clinic, claimed to have encountered Freeman walking along the road near Lenox on multiple occasions. Each time he appeared exactly as she remembered him, yet seemed unaware of her presence. When she called out to him, he simply vanished, leaving no trace of his passage. Dr. Morrison became increasingly obsessed with understanding Freeman's condition, devoting years to researching similar cases in medical literature from around the world. His private journals, discovered after his death, revealed a man consumed by guilt over his participation in Freeman's suffering. Morrison wrote extensively about his belief that Freeman had possessed some form of consciousness that transcended normal human experience, yet he could never articulate exactly what this meant in scientific terms. The papers discovered by Thomas Whitmore in 1848 were quietly returned to the courthouse archives, where they remained undisturbed for more than a century. Attempts to locate additional documentation about Freeman's life proved unsuccessful. No birth records, no slave manifests, no bills of sale bearing his name could be found in any archive throughout New England or the South. It was as if Freeman had materialized specifically for the purpose of Blackwood's experiments, then vanished once his role was complete. In 1962, a graduate student named Linda Hayes, conducting research on 19th-century medical practices, discovered the Whitmore papers during a routine archival survey. Hayes attempted to verify the details contained in the documents, but found that virtually every location, institution and individual mentioned had either disappeared or left no traceable record. The farmhouse where Blackwood conducted his clinic had burned to the ground in 1851. The Berkshire County Almshouse had been demolished in 1873. Even the cemetery where Freeman was supposedly buried had been relocated twice, with many graves left unmarked in the process. Hayes's doctoral dissertation, completed in 1964, examined the Freeman case as an example of unethical medical experimentation in antebellum America. Yet her research raised more questions than it answered. The level of documentation surrounding Freeman's case seemed excessive for someone of his social status, while the complete absence of corroborating evidence suggested either an elaborate fabrication or a systematic effort to erase all traces of what had occurred. The dissertation was accepted by Hayes's committee, but never published. According to university records, Hayes withdrew her request for publication just days before the scheduled printing date. She provided no explanation for this decision and refused to discuss her research with colleagues or students. Hayes left academic life entirely, taking a position as a librarian in a small town in Vermont, where she lived quietly until her death in 1998. Among Hayes's personal effects, her family discovered a small wooden box containing what appeared to be original documents from the Freeman case. These papers had not been part of the courthouse archive and contained details not found in any previously known source. Most significantly, the box included what appeared to be pages from Freeman's own journal, written in a clear, educated hand that seemed inconsistent with his supposed background as an enslaved person. The journal entries, if authentic, provided Freeman's own perspective on his extraordinary circumstances. He wrote about his awareness of existing in multiple states simultaneously, of perceiving events that had not yet occurred, and of communicating with individuals who existed in what he called the spaces between moments. The entries suggested that Freeman's condition was not the result of Blackwood's experiments, but rather something he had possessed since childhood. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. One passage, dated January 21st, 1848, read, "Dr. Blackwood believes he is studying me, yet I am studying him. He sees my body's refusal to surrender as a medical curiosity, but he cannot understand that surrender was never an option. I exist here only temporarily, as the observer of this particular arrangement of time and circumstance. Soon I will continue to the place I have always been traveling toward." Another entry, apparently written just days before Freeman's death, provided what might have been his final thoughts. "The crossing approaches, and I find myself grateful for the lessons learned in this strange interlude. Dr. Blackwood's curiosity allowed me to experience human suffering without being diminished by it. I have learned compassion through witnessing cruelty, and patience through enduring the limitations of linear time. When I depart this form, I will carry these lessons forward." The authenticity of these journal entries remains questionable. Handwriting analysis conducted in the 1970s suggested they were written by the same individual who produced other documents in the Freeman case, yet carbon dating of the paper proved inconclusive. Some researchers argued that the sophisticated language and philosophical content made it unlikely that Freeman himself was the author, while others pointed out that many enslaved individuals possessed far more education than historical records suggested. Dr. Morrison's final journal entry, written shortly before his own death, provided perhaps the most honest assessment of the Freeman case. Morrison wrote, "I have spent 16 years attempting to understand what I witnessed in that farmhouse, and I am no closer to an explanation than I was when I first encountered Elijah Freeman. Perhaps some phenomena exist beyond the reach of scientific inquiry, not because they violate natural law, but because they operate according to principles we have yet to discover." Freeman's gift, if it can be called that, was to demonstrate the limitations of our current understanding while suggesting possibilities that extend far beyond them. The final document in Linda Hayes's collection was a newspaper clipping from the Berkshire County Eagle, dated April 10th, 1848. The brief article reported the death of a transient individual at the county almshouse, noting only that the deceased had been a person of unusual circumstances who had attracted the attention of local physicians. The article concluded by stating that the individual would be buried in the almshouse cemetery, where his mortal remains might find the peace that seemed to elude him in life. Yet even this small recognition of Freeman's passing proved temporary. The newspaper's archives were destroyed in a fire in 1897, and no copies of the article exist in any other collection. The only evidence of its existence was the single clipping found among Hayes's papers, as if someone had deliberately preserved this final acknowledgement of Freeman's extraordinary life. Today, more than 170 years after Freeman's death, his story continues to resist easy categorization. The documentation surrounding his case suggests a level of systematic observation and recording that seems inconsistent with the medical practices of 1840s America, while the complete absence of corroborating evidence raises questions about whether the events described actually occurred. Yet the detailed nature of the surviving accounts, combined with their internal consistency, suggests that someone, somewhere, witnessed something that challenged their understanding of human existence. The location where Blackwood's clinic once stood is now part of a state forest preserve. Hiking trails wind through the area where Freeman spent his final winter. Though few visitors are aware of the property's unusual history, on certain evenings, when the light falls across the landscape at just the right angle, some hikers report seeing a solitary figure standing motionless among the trees. The figure never responds to calls or approaches and disappears if observed directly. These sightings are typically dismissed as tricks of light and shadow, yet they occur with sufficient frequency to have become part of local folklore. The broader implications of the Freeman case extend beyond questions of historical accuracy or scientific possibility. If Freeman's story contains even a grain of truth, it suggests that consciousness might operate according to principles fundamentally different from those recognized by conventional science. The idea that human awareness might exist independently of physical constraints, or that some individuals might possess abilities that transcend normal limitations, challenges assumptions that have guided medical and scientific thinking for centuries. Perhaps more significantly, Freeman's story raises uncomfortable questions about the treatment of marginalized individuals in the name of scientific progress. Whether or not Freeman possessed the extraordinary abilities attributed to him, there is no question that he was subjected to experimentation without his meaningful consent, treated as an object of curiosity rather than a human being deserving of dignity and respect. The fact that his suffering was documented with such clinical detachment serves as a reminder of medicine's capacity for both healing and harm. The mystery surrounding Freeman's identity and origins also highlights the systematic erasure of individual stories that characterized the period of American slavery. Millions of people lived and died without leaving any documentary trace, their names and experiences lost to history. Freeman's case is unusual only because someone chose to record it, not because his suffering was unique. The detailed documentation of his extraordinary circumstances exists alongside the complete absence of information about his ordinary humanity, his childhood, his family, his hopes and fears, his life before he encountered Dr. Blackwood. Modern researchers who have attempted to verify elements of Freeman's story have discovered a curious pattern in the historical record. While specific details about Freeman himself cannot be confirmed, the broader context of his case proves remarkably accurate. The individuals mentioned in the documents existed and lived where the papers suggest they did. The locations described can be precisely identified on period maps. The medical techniques attributed to Dr. Blackwood align perfectly with experimental procedures known to have been conducted during that era. This mixture of verifiable historical detail and unverifiable central claims has led some scholars to suggest that the Freeman case represents a form of historical allegory, a story constructed to illustrate broader truths about the period rather than to document specific events. According to this interpretation, Freeman's extraordinary characteristics serve as metaphors for the resilience of the human spirit under extreme circumstances, while his treatment by Blackwood represents the dehumanizing aspects of 19th-century scientific racism. Yet other researchers argue that the level of specific detail contained in the Freeman documents suggests they were intended as factual reports rather than allegorical fiction. The precision with which locations, dates, and individuals are identified, combined with the clinical tone of the medical observations, seems inconsistent with purely literary purposes. Moreover, the scattered nature of the surviving documentation, with papers discovered in different archives over a period of decades, suggests an effort to preserve historical evidence rather than create a coherent narrative. The question of Freeman's ultimate fate remains perhaps the most intriguing aspect of his story. According to the official records, he died peacefully in the Berkshire County almshouse and was buried in an unmarked grave. Yet the subsequent reports of sightings, combined with the mysterious circumstances surrounding the documentation of his case, suggest that his story may not have ended with his physical death. Whether these reports represent genuine paranormal phenomena, cases of mistaken identity, or simply the power of suggestion acting upon individuals familiar with Freeman's story, they serve to keep his memory alive in the collective imagination of the region. The scientific questions raised by Freeman's case remain largely unanswered, perhaps because they cannot be answered within the framework of conventional inquiry. The possibility that consciousness might operate independently of physical constraints, or that some individuals might possess abilities that transcend normal human limitations, continues to challenge researchers in fields ranging from neuroscience to quantum physics. While few modern scientists would accept the specific claims made about Freeman's abilities, many acknowledge that our understanding of consciousness remains incomplete. Recent developments in neuroscience and psychology have revealed phenomena that previous generations of researchers would have considered impossible. The discovery of neuroplasticity, the recognition that consciousness can persist during periods of apparent brain death, and the documentation of extraordinary cases of human resilience under extreme conditions have all expanded our understanding of human potential. While none of these findings directly validate the claims made about Freeman, they suggest that the boundaries of human experience may be less fixed than once believed. The ethical dimensions of Freeman's case continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about medical research and human experimentation. The recognition that Freeman was subjected to procedures without his meaningful consent, regardless of their purported scientific value, serves as a historical example of exploitation disguised as inquiry. The detailed documentation of his suffering, presented in the dispassionate language of scientific observation, illustrates how clinical objectivity can serve to obscure rather than illuminate moral responsibility. Modern medical ethics, with its emphasis on informed consent, patient autonomy, and the primacy of individual welfare over scientific advancement, represents a direct response to the kinds of abuses exemplified by Freeman's treatment. Yet the fundamental tension between scientific curiosity and human dignity remains unresolved. The desire to understand extraordinary phenomena, particularly those that challenge conventional knowledge, continues to create ethical dilemmas for researchers and practitioners across multiple disciplines. The preservation and transmission of Freeman's story also raises questions about the responsibility of historians and scholars to distinguish between documented fact and compelling narrative. The fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence makes it impossible to verify many of the claims about Freeman's extraordinary abilities. Yet the consistency and detail of the accounts make it equally impossible to dismiss them entirely. This uncertainty places Freeman's story in a category shared by many historical events that exist at the intersection of documented fact and persistent legend. The influence of Freeman's case extends beyond academic circles into popular culture, where his story has inspired numerous works of fiction and speculation. Writers and filmmakers have drawn upon elements of his narrative to explore themes of human resilience, scientific ethics, and the boundaries between life and death. While these creative interpretations often depart significantly from the historical documentation, they serve to keep Freeman's memory alive and to introduce new generations to the questions his case continues to raise. The geographic location where Freeman's story unfolded has itself become part of the narrative's enduring appeal. The Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts, with their long history of isolation and independence, provide an appropriate setting for a tale that exists at the margins of conventional understanding. The region's association with transcendentalist philosophy, experimental communities, and artistic creativity creates a cultural context in which Freeman's extraordinary characteristics seem less implausible than they might in other settings. Local historians and genealogists continue to search for additional evidence about Freeman's background and the circumstances that brought him to Dr. Blackwood's attention. Despite decades of intensive research, no definitive proof of Freeman's pre-experiment existence has been discovered. This absence of evidence has led some researchers to conclude that Freeman never existed, while others argue that it simply reflects the systematic erasure of records relating to enslaved and marginalized individuals. The medical aspects of Freeman's case continue to intrigue researchers interested in the boundaries of human physiology and consciousness. While modern science cannot validate the specific claims made about Freeman's abilities to survive normally fatal conditions, documented cases of individuals displaying extraordinary resilience under extreme circumstances suggest that the human body's capacity for survival may exceed conventional understanding. These cases, while rare, provide a scientific context within which Freeman's story becomes marginally more plausible. The psychological dimensions of Freeman's condition, as described in the historical documents, align in some respects with contemporary understanding of dissociative states, trauma responses, and altered consciousness. The reports that Freeman seemed to exist simultaneously in present reality and some other state of being mirror descriptions of individuals who've experienced severe psychological trauma. While this explanation cannot account for the physical anomalies attributed to Freeman, it provides a framework for understanding at least some aspects of his reported behavior. The spiritual and philosophical implications of Freeman's story continue to generate discussion among theologians, philosophers, and researchers interested in consciousness studies. The suggestion that Freeman possessed awareness that transcended normal human limitations resonates with mystical traditions from around the world, while his apparent ability to exist simultaneously in multiple states of being echoes concepts found in quantum physics and advanced consciousness research. The documentation of Freeman's case, regardless of its ultimate veracity, serves as a unique window into 19th century attitudes toward race, science, and human experimentation. The clinical tone in which Freeman's suffering is described, combined with the complete absence of any consideration for his welfare or autonomy, illustrates the dehumanizing effects of scientific racism and the treatment of enslaved individuals as experimental subjects rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The preservation of Freeman's story through multiple generations, despite the absence of official recognition or academic validation, demonstrates the power of narrative to transmit meaning across time. Whether Freeman's case represents historical fact, elaborated legend, or sophisticated allegory, it continues to raise questions about the nature of human consciousness, the ethics of scientific inquiry, and the responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members. The ultimate significance of Elijah Freeman's story may lie not in determining whether the extraordinary events described actually occurred, but in recognizing what those events represent about the human condition and our relationship to forces beyond our understanding. In an age increasingly dominated by scientific materialism and technological control, Freeman's case serves as a reminder that mystery and wonder continue to exist at the edges of human experience, waiting to challenge our assumptions about what is possible and what is real. As we reflect on Freeman's legacy more than a century and a half after his reported death, we are left with questions that resist easy answers. Did Elijah Freeman possess abilities that transcended normal human limitations? Was he the victim of unethical medical experimentation or something else entirely? Do the documents that preserve his story represent authentic historical evidence, or are they elaborate fabrications designed to serve some other purpose? Perhaps the most honest answer is that we simply do not know, and may never know, with certainty. What we can say with confidence is that Freeman's story, however it originated, continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the complexity and mystery that surrounds human consciousness and the ethical responsibilities that accompany scientific inquiry. In preserving and transmitting his narrative, we honor not only his memory, but also our own commitment to maintaining wonder and humility in the face of phenomena that challenge our understanding of what it means to be human. The sound of winter wind through the bare trees of the Berkshire Mountains carries with it the echoes of a story that refuses to be forgotten. In that sound, some listeners claim to hear the whisper of a voice that once belonged to a man named Elijah Freeman, a man whose existence challenged the boundaries between the possible and impossible, between life and death, between the known and unknowable. Whether that voice belongs to memory, imagination, or something else entirely, it continues to ask questions that demand our attention and deserve our consideration. Years later, those few who remember Freeman's name speak of him with a mixture of fascination and unease. His story serves as a bridge between the documented horrors of America's past and the continuing mysteries of human consciousness. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the preservation of his memory, however uncertain its foundation, represents a form of justice for a man who lived and died at the margins of society, whose extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary courage, and whose legacy challenges us to expand our understanding of what it means to be human. The archives remain open, waiting for new researchers to discover additional fragments of Freeman's story. The forest, where Blackwood's clinic once stood, continues to shelter whatever secrets it may hold, And somewhere in the spaces between documented fact and persistent legend, the figure of Elijah Freeman endures, neither fully present nor entirely absent, a reminder that some questions transcend the boundaries of time, science, and understanding. In 1968, the final piece of Freeman's puzzle emerged when demolition crews working on the old Berkshire County courthouse discovered a sealed room behind a false wall in the basement. Inside, they found a single leather-bound journal bearing Dr. Blackwood's name, along with a small wooden box containing what appeared to be personal effects. The journal's final entry, dated April 6, 1848, contained Blackwood's last written words about his extraordinary subject. "Freeman departed this morning without ceremony or explanation," Blackwood had written in increasingly erratic script. "I found him standing at his window as always, but when I spoke his name, he turned to look at me directly for the first time since our acquaintance began. His eyes held no accusation, no anger, only a profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just his own suffering, but the suffering of countless others whose names will never be recorded. He nodded once, as if acknowledging something I could not understand, then simply was not. His body remained, but whatever made Elijah Freeman who he was had departed for that crossing he spoke of so often. The wooden box contained 3 items: a small piece of carved wood bearing symbols that resembled no known alphabet, a pressed flower of a species that botanists could not identify, and a single page of text written in Freeman's careful handwriting. The page contained what appeared to be a message intended for future readers. To those who seek to understand what cannot be explained, remember that some gifts come disguised as curses, and some freedoms can only be found through the deepest bondage. I was never truly enslaved, for my consciousness belonged to no master. Yet I was never truly free, for I was bound to witness suffering I could not prevent. In death, I find the balance that eluded me in life." The demolition crew turned these items over to local authorities, who filed them in the same archives where Thomas Whitmore had made his original discovery. The room where they were found had been sealed since the 1850s, yet the journal and box showed no signs of age or deterioration, as if time had somehow passed them by. Dr. Margaret Chen, a historian specializing in 19th-century medical practices, became the last known researcher to examine the complete Freeman archive before it was permanently sealed in 1969. Her brief report, submitted to the Massachusetts Historical Society, concluded that the documentation was either an elaborate hoax or evidence of events that fell outside conventional historical understanding. Chen recommended that the archive be preserved but restricted, noting that Freeman's story raised questions about the nature of consciousness and identity that contemporary scholarship is not equipped to address. The archive was subsequently transferred to a private collection, where it remains to this day. Access is limited to qualified researchers who sign agreements acknowledging the uncertain provenance of the materials. No comprehensive study of the Freeman case has been published since Chen's report, though elements of his story continue to appear in academic discussions about medical ethics and the treatment of marginalized populations in historical research. On cold winter nights, when the wind moves through the bare trees of the Berkshire Mountains, local residents sometimes report hearing sounds that cannot be easily explained. A voice carried on the wind, speaking words in a language that seems familiar yet unidentifiable. Footsteps on frozen ground where no tracks can be found. The sound of someone breathing slowly and deliberately, as if maintaining consciousness required constant effort. These reports are typically dismissed as acoustic tricks created by wind and weather, yet they persist across generations. Parents tell their children about the man who lived between worlds, who suffered in silence so that others might understand the true cost of cruelty. Children grow up to tell their own children, ensuring that Freeman's memory survives even as the historical evidence of his existence grows more fragmented with each passing year. The questions Freeman's story raises about consciousness, suffering, and the boundaries of human experience remain as relevant today as they were in 1848. In a world still struggling with issues of medical ethics, human experimentation, and the treatment of marginalized populations, Freeman's case serves as a reminder that some injustices transcend time and circumstance. His story challenges us to consider not just what we know about human potential, but how we use that knowledge and at whose expense we pursue our understanding. Perhaps Elijah Freeman's greatest gift to history is not the mystery of his extraordinary abilities, but the clarity with which his story illuminates our ongoing responsibility to protect the vulnerable and respect the dignity of all human consciousness, regardless of its form or expression. In preserving his memory, we acknowledge that some stories, once told, can never be completely forgotten, and some voices, once silenced, continue to speak across the centuries, demanding that we listen, learn, and remember. The wind through the Berkshire Mountains carries many stories, but none quite like that of Elijah Freeman, a man whose life challenged every assumption about what it means to be human, and whose death may have been simply another form of transformation. In the end, that may be the most important lesson his story has to offer, that consciousness, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only changed from one form to another. The archives sleep in their climate-controlled storage, the forest keeps its silent vigil, and somewhere in the space between memory and legend, Elijah Freeman continues his journey toward that crossing he always knew awaited him. His story ends not with answers, but with the recognition that some questions are more valuable than any conclusion we might reach. For in questioning what we think we know about the limits of human experience, we open ourselves to possibilities that extend far beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. And in that openness, perhaps, lies the true legacy of Elijah Freeman, the gift of wonder, the courage to doubt, and the wisdom to know that some mysteries are meant to endure,